The last transmission from Helion Primus was not a scream, not a call for help, but a whisper dragged through static and ash. "They came in light," the voice said, and then the signal fractured into a sound that could have been the dying hum of a reactor or the sigh of a god closing its eyes. For 3 hours after that, the orbital relays spat nothing but static and patterns that the Mechanicus could not decipher. When the noise stopped, the silence that followed had weight. It pressed against the mind like deep water. Even the most hardened tech adepts would later claim that in that silence, something was listening back. Helion Primus had always been forgettable, one more manufacturum world choked in its own smog, a sphere of smoke and prayer where the laboring faithful built weapons for wars they would never see. 27 million human souls lived and died beneath the planetary haze, their lives recorded in administratum ledgers that no one ever read. No one remembered them until the sky tore open. It began as a color, not light as the human eye understands it, but a hue that seemed to exist in defiance of language. Some called it violet, others swore it was gold. The blind said it was the color of pain. The picked feeds showed only distortion, but those who looked up in person described a veil spreading across the heavens, a shimmering wave of something alive. It did not descend, it unfolded. Within minutes, manufacturum spires began to disintegrate, not from heat or impact, but as if the material itself rejected existence. Entire hives flickered like fading memories. Governor Hadrian Voss, a man whose faith was the only clean thing about him, took to the planetary vox to declare a miracle. "Rejoice," he said, "for the Emperor cleanses his world." His voice cracked as he said it. Perhaps he already knew that miracles in the 41st millennium never end in salvation. The ecclesiarchy spread his words. Choirs filled the temples, their chants bleeding into the endless industrial hum. And for a moment the world sang in harmony with its own ending. Then the upper hive floors liquefied. Ferrocrete turned to dust, steel melted without heat, and those who touched the walls found their hands sinking into the matter as if it were dreaming. The light had texture, like breath on glass. The astropaths orbiting above felt the change before they saw it. Their minds filled with a music that was neither beautiful nor kind. One wrote the same phrase over and over on his cell walls until his fingers blurred. "The Eldar are coming." Then he tore out his tongue so he would never speak the name aloud again. The word spread through vox lines faster than any order. Eldar, the ancient race, the lost ones, the gods who fell and cursed the stars with their death cry. No one understood why they would come to Helion Primus, a world of rust and sweat and forgotten prayers. The Astra Militarum prepared for battle anyway, though every seasoned officer knew it was an act of ritual more than strategy. There was no surviving an Eldar visitation. The sky pulsed like a heartbeat. The light no longer simply glowed, it breathed. Whole districts found themselves drowned in radiance that painted every shadow with impossible detail. Trees bloomed and burned in the same instant. Oceans turned to mirrors. Those who dared to look upward claimed they saw figures moving through the veil, tall and graceful, their armor reflecting constellations that did not belong to this galaxy. Some dropped to their knees in worship. Others clawed at their eyes, trying to tear the visions out. Then the first vessel descended. It did not fall, nor burn, nor roar. It drifted down like a snowflake from eternity, silent, flawless, its hull made of light bent around something too perfect to exist. Every auspex screamed as the readings broke into incoherence. The ship emitted no energy signature, yet its mere presence distorted gravity. Mountains leaned toward it as if bowing, and then a voice, not through vox, not through air, directly into the thoughts of every living being on the planet. "We come to end your suffering." There was no malice in it, only sorrow, an immense, suffocating sorrow that pressed into the hearts of all who heard. Millions fell to their knees, not from worship but from the unbearable weight of compassion that was not meant for human minds. It was as if the sun itself had pitied them, and that pity was worse than hate. When the ships reached the surface, they did not strike or fire. They blossomed. Sections of their hulls unfolded like petals, each emitting a soft radiance that turned night to dawn. From within came the Eldar. Their forms were tall, elegant, clad in armor that shimmered between spirit and matter. Each carried a staff inscribed with runes that moved like living creatures. They did not walk. They glided, leaving no footprint, no sound but the faint hum of psychic resonance. The first platoon of soldiers opened fire out of reflex. Lasguns flashed, painting red light across the haze. The beams touched the Eldar and vanished into nothing, absorbed as if swallowed by the air itself. Then the soldiers fell, one by one, collapsing without wounds. Some died instantly. Others lay twitching, whispering things in languages that had not existed for 10,000 years. Those who survived said the Eldar did not even look at them. It was not contempt. It was absence. To the Eldar, the soldiers were insects caught in the wind of destiny. Within an hour, every communications relay across the planet began broadcasting the same signal, not words, not coordinates, but a song. It was slow, mournful, and beautiful in a way that hurt. The song carried across Vox and airwaves alike, synchronizing heartbeats, guiding minds. The people who heard it began to walk. They left their homes, their workstations, their temples. Entire cities emptied as men, women, and children marched toward the points of light where the Eldar ships hovered. No one resisted. No one screamed. They simply walked, as if following a promise they had always known but never remembered. Priests dropped their censers and joined the march. Servitors stopped mid-task, their augmetics twitching in strange rhythms. Even the planetary governor abandoned his throne room and walked barefoot into the light. In orbit, the last surviving Mechanicus observer recorded a single pict feed before his station's sensors failed. It showed the surface of Helion Primus covered in streams of people, all moving in perfect silence toward the descending ships. The observer tried to hail them, but his voice dissolved into static. Before his systems failed completely, he whispered a prayer to the Omnissiah, not for salvation, but for understanding. The ships opened their lower hulls. Inside was not machinery, but radiance shaped like a cathedral. Pillars of light rose into infinity, and in the center stood something vast and faceless, wrapped in veils of psychic fire. The people entered willingly. Some smiled, some wept, some raised their hands toward the shape as if greeting an old friend. Then they disappeared, one by one, their bodies dissolving into motes of gold that drifted upward into the hull. To the few who remained outside, it looked like ascension. To those who understood even a fragment of what they were seeing, it was something else entirely. The Eldar were not killing them. They were preserving them, capturing their souls before the corruption of humanity's age could claim them. In the logic of the Eldar, it was mercy. By the time the light faded, Helion Primus was empty. No screams, no ruins, no blood, only silence and dust where cities once stood. The Mechanicus relay orbiting the dead world caught one final burst of signal before its instruments overloaded. A whisper, soft as a confession. Mercy granted. Then the stars themselves seemed to blink. The signal that reached the segmentum relay was short and soundless. Little more than a sequence of psychic echoes burned into the transmission code itself. When the tech priests decrypted it, the data spilled like blood across the noospheric link, shattering their augmetic calm. There were no words, only images embedded in the psychic residue, a world turning inside out in silence, oceans of glass reflecting impossible constellations, human faces dissolving into patterns of light that formed runes no machine could interpret. The adepts sealed the file immediately, stamping it with the sigil of heretic quarantine. The designation was brief and chilling. Incident Helion Primus Mercy Class Anomaly. Weeks passed before the Inquisition responded. The Ordo Xenos dispatched a single frigate, the St. Enoch's Remnant, to investigate. Its commander, Inquisitor Marek Holt, was not a man prone to imagination. He had spent 30 years dissecting the horrors of the Outer Rim, and there were few things left in the galaxy that could truly unnerve him. When he read the Mechanicus report, he laughed once dryly, then ordered the ship into translation. By the time they reached Helion Primus, the system had been declared spiritually contaminated. Every orbital marker bore a warning sigil glowing in silent Vox transmissions. The first auger sweep showed a world both pristine and wrong. The atmosphere was breathable, the radiation low, and yet the planet radiated a psychic field measurable even from orbit. It pulsed like a heartbeat that was not there. Holt ordered the ship into high anchor, and the landing craft descended through the cloud layer. As the atmosphere peeled away, the crew saw what remained of Helion Primus. It was beautiful. That was the first horror. Cities that had once been blackened manufactorums were now pale and smooth, shaped into curves that followed no human geometry. The towers rose like the bones of giants, seamless and polished, glinting with reflections of a sun that seemed too near. The oceans were sheets of glass, rippled only by memory. There were no corpses, no bones, no trace of decay. Every sign of human life had been scrubbed away as if the species had never existed here. The pilots refused to descend further. They muttered about voices on the Vox, whispers promising peace, forgiveness, sleep. Holt ordered them down at gunpoint. When the landing craft touched the surface, the hull vibrated, humming to a rhythm that was almost musical. The soil beneath their boots was not dirt, but fine ash fused into crystal. It shimmered when they stepped, reflecting the light in colors that shifted too quickly for the eye to follow. The Inquisitor walked ahead alone, his power armor's servos whirring softly. He was not a superstitious man, but even he could feel it, the quiet pressure in the air, the sense of presence. He raised his auspex and began scanning. The readings were impossible. The planet's surface carried residual psychic energy at levels rivaling those recorded on Daemon worlds, but there was no sign of chaos. The pattern was too ordered, too pure. It was not corruption. It was control. As they moved deeper into what had once been the capital hive, the architecture changed. The walls were smooth and translucent, the interiors glowing with a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse in response to their breathing. Holt placed his hand against one surface, and it felt warm, alive. For a moment, he thought he saw movement within the glass shapes of people walking, frozen mid-step, their outlines faint and luminous. When he blinked, they were gone. They found the first real structure in what had once been the planetary cathedral. The building's shape remained, but it had been transformed into something that could only be described as sacred to another species. The Aquila insignia had been replaced by an elegant sigil of intertwining lines that shimmered faintly with psychic residue. Holt recognized it from Forbidden Archives, an Eldar rune meaning transcendence through release. Inside, the air was filled with faint vibrations, like the hum of distant machinery or the murmur of a crowd. At the center of the hall stood a massive crystal obelisk, and within it, faint silhouettes drifted like smoke trapped in amber. They were human, thousands of them, their faces serene, eyes closed, expressions of peace etched in glass. Each one glowed faintly with inner light. One of Holt's acolytes approached too closely. The obelisk responded. The glass rippled like water, and a whisper escaped, a woman's voice, soft, gentle, speaking low Gothic with perfect clarity. "Do not fear. We are safe now." The acolyte screamed, stumbled backward, and fired his weapon. The lasbolt struck the crystal and dissolved harmlessly. The voice continued, unbothered. "The Eldar gave us mercy. We are beyond the pain now." Holt ordered the acolyte silent, then stepped closer. The obelisk hummed under his gaze, its light deepening to crimson. For a moment, the Inquisitor saw the truth. The souls within were not at peace. They were moving, their mouths opening and closing in endless silent pleas. Their bodies were illusions. Their consciousnesses had been bound, preserved in psychic resonance. They were still alive. He activated his Vox. "This is Inquisitor Holt," confirmed Zeno's intervention. "Estimated population preservation total. Classification soul containment technology. Immediate excommunication of this system required." Before his transmission could reach orbit, the air changed. A presence entered the hall, not with noise or light, but with a slow compression of reality itself. Holt's acolytes fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The crystal pillars trembled, and the walls seemed to breathe. From the far end of the hall came a shimmer, then a figure tall, slender, moving like a reflection on water, an Eldar. It wore armor that glowed softly with embedded runes, and in its hands was a staff that pulsed like a living nerve. Its helm was shaped like a tear, its eyes hidden behind lenses that reflected the entire chamber in miniature. Holt raised his bolt pistol, but the Eldar did not react. It simply regarded him for a long moment, and when it spoke, its voice entered his mind like the memory of light. "You mistake cruelty for mercy." They asked to be free of fear. We granted them peace beyond the reach of your God. A Holt's trigger finger twitched. He wanted to shoot, to purge, to end this abomination, but something deeper than fear stopped him. The Eldar's presence was overwhelming, not hostile, not even commanding, but absolute. He could feel the echo of their minds, vast and ancient, filled with grief. He saw flashes of their history, their fall, their endless mourning. "What have you done?" Holt whispered aloud. The Eldar tilted its head slightly. "We have undone suffering. You build empires on agony and call it faith. We take that pain and still it forever. Is that not what your emperor desires?" Holt fired. The bolt round exploded in midair, deflected by a shimmer of psychic energy. The Eldar did not move. Its voice was softer now, almost sorrowful. "You will call this heresy. You will call it damnation. But in time you will understand. Mercy is the final weapon." The obelisk pulsed. Light poured from the crystal, filling the hall. The humans screamed as their forms disintegrated into motes of dust, leaving only armor and weapons behind. Holt's last sensation was of warmth, as if embraced by the very thing he had feared all his life. When the St. Enoch's remnant lost contact with the surface, the ship's sensors recorded a single surge of psychic radiation equivalent to a dying star. Then the planet went dark again. The last thing detected before total silence was a faint pulse, repeating endlessly from the planet's surface. It was a single phrase, encoded in both psychic and electromagnetic frequencies. "Mercy granted." The data logs from the St. Enoch's remnant never made it to Terra. The transmission was received by an Inquisitorial relay fortress in the Cadian Fringe, but when the adepts opened the file, the information was already wrong. It pulsed in rhythmic intervals, like a heartbeat hidden inside the machine's spirit. The servitors that decrypted it stopped mid-task, heads tilting toward the ceiling, eyes glowing with pale gold light. Then they began to whisper in perfect unison, "Mercy granted." At first, the fortress master ordered a purge of the corrupted cogitators. But the contamination was not mechanical, it was psychic. The phrase appeared in sleep logs, in Auspex readings, even in the flicker of lumen globes. Tech priests began to dream. Their dreams were vivid, filled with visions of Helion Primus, a world remade in luminous stillness, its people standing beneath radiant skies with expressions of eternal calm. When the adepts woke, many of them were smiling, their eyes unfocused, murmuring about salvation. Within 3 days, the fortress was lost. The final log entry, recorded by an Ordo Genos archivist named Delane Cray, described a sound like distant singing echoing through the void outside the hull. "It's spreading," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Through the warp. Through us. It feels kind." Then her vox cut to static, and the relay fortress fell silent forever. The Inquisition sealed the entire sector. Helion Primus and the surrounding systems were declared Perdita-class quarantines, interdicted under threat of exterminatus. The official record stated it was due to a psychic plague of unknown origin. But among the upper tiers of the Ordo, the truth was whispered in private. The Eldar had done something that even Chaos had never achieved. They had weaponized mercy. In the following months, astropaths across 3 sectors began to experience identical visions. They reported a light blooming at the edge of the Astronomican's reach, a golden flame that whispered forgiveness. Entire choir ships went dark after transmitting the same final message. The pain has ended. Even seasoned navigators, those who had stared into the warp all their lives, began refusing to translate through affected regions. They said the currents there were no longer violent, but eerily still, as if the Sea of Souls itself had been tranquilized. The Adeptus Mechanicus tried to rationalize it. They dispatched a fleet of explorator vessels under Margot's Rhine Galtar to chart the anomaly spread. When the fleet reached the edge of the Helion system, every machine spirit aboard began humming the same low tone. The Magos recorded it, analyzing the waveform. It matched the frequency of human neural patterns during moments of absolute calm. He noted this observation moments before his ship's Vox systems filled with voices, his own voice, multiplied and overlapping. Each copy repeated the same phrase in perfect cadence. "It's beautiful. We are free." Then every ship in the fleet powered down simultaneously, drifting in silence like a graveyard of devotion. The Inquisition called it psychic contagion. The Eldar called it healing. On the craft world of Ibrazel, far from imperial space, the Farseer Valeth stood before a council of seers and listened to the tremor of the webway. The skein of fate shimmered with golden light. The threads of thousands of human lives burned and faded, leaving no trace of suffering, no echo of despair. Only stillness. She closed her eyes, feeling both triumph and grief. "It is done," she said softly. "Another world rescued from its own torment." But the younger seers looked uneasy. "You call it rescue," one said. "I call it annihilation." Their souls were not guided to the infinity circuit. They were sealed. "You have created prisons of mercy." They Glowlith's eyes opened. They glowed faintly with the light of 1,000 futures. "Better prisons than pain," she answered. "Their species has drowned itself in agony for 10,000 years. We give them release. We do what the Mon K cannot. We remember compassion, even when it hurts. Compassion." The younger seer spat. "You play at gods with stolen lives. You sing their souls into silence and call it grace." Valeth turned away. "If they had seen what we have seen, they would thank us." Her words echoed through the chamber, a psionic resonance that rippled across the infinity circuit like a sigh. For a moment, the entire craft world felt the faintest trace of human thought, billions of voices murmuring in unison, serene and endless. The Inquisition's countermeasures were brutal. Exterminatus orders were issued to 3 adjacent systems showing signs of psychic pacification. Orbital bombardments turned worlds into glass. The Vox networks filled with the sounds of dying populations praying for deliverance that had already come. The Imperial Creed declared mercy a heresy. "Mercy is the lie that weakens the will of man," preached Cardinal Durest on terror. "Only suffering proves faith." But even in the heart of the Imperium, something had begun to change. On shrine worlds, pilgrims began reporting miracles, statues weeping golden light, hymns harmonizing with voices that were not human. Some said they felt warmth during prayer, a calm that silenced fear. Ecclesiastical investigators found that the affected worshippers no longer felt pain, no disease, no grief, no guilt. They simply stopped caring whether they lived or died. Within months, hundreds of shrines were emptied. The faithful walked out into the wastelands smiling, their bodies later found desiccated, drained of life but untouched by decay. The Inquisition burned the shrines. The Adeptus Ministorum blamed chaos. But in the astropathic network, messages began to appear written in pure gold code, mercy granted. It reached the High Lords within a year. The sigil of the Eldar began manifesting in imperial data streams, in the flicker of holo projectors, in the whispers of servitors as they dreamed. Some thought it was infiltration. Others thought it was prophecy. One Lord Admiral slit his wrists on the Senate floor, carving the rune into his arm before he died. His final words were heard by every vox in the chamber. "They forgive us." Even the Grey Knights felt it. Their librarians reported psychic tremors in their meditation chambers, waves of calm so absolute they broke concentration. Some claimed to see a golden light hovering behind their eyelids, whispering that their war was over. The chapter sealed itself within Titan's vaults and cut communication with the rest of the Imperium. No one ever found out how far it spread. What the Imperium never understood was that the Eldar had not intended conquest. They were dying. Every act of mercy was a funeral rite. They were transferring fragments of their own souls into the psychic prisons that held human consciousness, intertwining their essence with the race they pitied most. Each world pacified was another bead on the rosary of their extinction. They were building a monument to their own compassion, a grave made of light. On the edge of the segmentum obscurus, a lone astropath drifted through the void in a crippled shuttle. His name was Lucen Falt, one of the few who had resisted the psychic song. His eyes were burned black by visions. His hands shook as he dictated his last message into a cracked Vox recorder. "They're not destroying us," he whispered. "They're saving us from ourselves. The Eldar are dying, and they've decided not to die alone." The transmission ended with a single tone, a frequency so pure it erased itself from the medium. And somewhere, deep in the warp, the light of Helion Primus still burns, a beacon of peace in a universe that has forgotten what peace means. Those who hear its call do not return. They join the choir of the forgiven, their souls woven into a mercy that feels indistinguishable from oblivion. Because in the end, the Eldar did not come to destroy mankind, they came to teach it their final truth, that in a universe of eternal suffering, mercy is the cruelest gift of all. The first to notice the change were the navigators. They called it the stillness, a pocket of warp space that no longer screamed. The void between stars had always been alive, seething, bleeding, shifting with the tides of souls and the agony of 10,000 dying worlds. But within the borders of the Helion Expanse, the screaming stopped. The Imperium there was cold and flat, its currents frozen in crystalline perfection. Ships passing near it found their Geller fields quieting, their decks settling into a silence so profound it made even machine spirits uneasy. Navigators who gazed into it saw a golden horizon instead of chaos. Some were driven mad by the absence of madness, others wept openly, saying they could feel every pain they had ever buried fading away. The Inquisition quarantined them, but the infection spread faster than any quarantine could contain. It was not transmitted by contact, but by the idea itself. Those who heard about the stillness began dreaming of it. Those who dreamed of it stopped fearing death. At first, the Imperium celebrated. Worlds long plagued by warp storms now reported stable routes. Merchant fleets traversed sectors previously unreachable. Astropath spoke of clear channels, of messages arriving without distortion. The Administratum called it a logistical renaissance. The Ecclesiarchy called it the Emperor's blessing. But the Inquisition knew better. Nothing good ever spread this cleanly. Nothing peaceful ever came without a price. The Ordo Xenos dispatched a conclave of 5 Inquisitors, each with retinues of psychers and sanctioned assassins. Their ship, the Merciful Eye, entered the Expanse to trace the psychic origin of the anomaly. What they found was not a source but a field, a vast lattice of still energy stretching across light years, its geometry almost organic, its pulse in perfect rhythm with human thought. The Inquisitors studied it for 8 minutes before the first of them began to pray. It was Inquisitor Vale Corin who succumbed first. His mind, already half mechanized, recorded his final thoughts before his death. "The song is not an invasion," he wrote. "It's an invitation. Every soul it touches forgets its pain. Every hatred dissolves. The warp itself is being tamed." The transmission ended there, his voice softening mid-sentence into a tone that was almost reverent. His body was found later in the ship's chapel, kneeling before an icon that had reshaped itself into an Eldar rune of compassion. One by one, the others followed. They didn't fight. They simply stopped. The psychers who tried to resist described it as drowning in serenity. The Geller field dimmed, and the ship's machine, spirit, began humming the same golden frequency that had consumed Helion Primus. By the time the Merciful Eye drifted back toward Imperial space, its crew were statues, flesh crystallized into perfect serenity, their faces lit by faint inner glow. They looked content. The Mechanicus dissected the ship in orbit around Mars. The crystalline bodies emitted faint psychic resonance identical across every specimen, as if a single consciousness pulsed through them all. The Magi called it structural mercy, a phrase that would never appear again in official archives because the Inquisition burned the research within the hour. But the data couldn't be unlearned. Every Magos who had seen it began dreaming in gold. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor's tarot went blank. No card drawn showed triumph or ruin, death or rebirth. Only the same image repeated, a human figure surrounded by light, eyes closed, smiling faintly. The High Lords grew terrified. They ordered the Adeptus Astartes to assemble a cordon fleet to scar the Expanse with atomic fire. The bombardment lasted 27 hours. Worlds turned to glass, atmospheres boiled away, the very crusts of planets shattered into orbiting fragments. When the fleet withdrew, the region glowed with residual energy for a century. The mission was declared a success. The Helion anomaly was considered purged. But then came the dreams. Crew across the fleet began waking in the night, tears streaming down their faces, whispering the same words in unison. "We killed them for loving us." The ship's chaplains reported widespread breakdowns. Soldiers knelt in corridors weeping, praying not for forgiveness but for the return of the golden light. Officers purged their own men. Some entire companies opened the airlocks willingly, stepping into the void with smiles of peace. The ecclesiarchy could not stop the contagion, because it was not blasphemy. It was belief. The faith of the Imperium had always been rooted in suffering, in the idea that pain was proof of devotion. But this was faith stripped of fear. Pure, uncontrolled. Those who felt it no longer obeyed. They no longer needed to. Across the segmentum, shrines began emptying again. Pilgrims vanished into deserts, walking toward invisible lights. Choirs sang without instruction, voices harmonizing in alien melodies. For psychers who tried to interpret the phenomenon heard whispers in the warp, thousands of human souls, serene and luminous, speaking as one. Their message was always the same: we forgive you. On Terra, the Inquisition gathered in secret. The conclave was small, silent, paranoid. They spoke not of Xenos heresy, but of the nature of salvation. If the Eldar's mercy could calm the warp, could it also end the wars of mankind? Could peace itself be a weapon against chaos? One Inquisitor, an old man named Rel Darsk, proposed something that would have been unthinkable in any other age. If mercy weakens the warp, he said, then perhaps the Emperor's silence is not neglect. Perhaps he waits for us to learn what we must surrender to end the screaming. The room erupted in outrage, pistols drawn, oaths of purgation shouted. Yet even as they argued, one by one, each Inquisitor began to tremble. They could feel it, a warmth blooming in the marrow of their bones, a serenity that dulled rage and erased conviction. When the custodes arrived 3 hours later, the chamber was silent. Every Inquisitor sat peacefully in their seat, eyes closed, lips curved in faint smiles. There were no signs of violence, no psychic residue, just the smell of incense and the faint echo of a song that was never written. They were buried in unmarked vaults beneath the palace, but those who tended the graves swore they could feel light behind the stone. And so the Imperium began to fracture, not with rebellion or war, but with stillness. Armies laid down their weapons. Planetary governors stopped issuing decrees. Entire forge worlds halted production as their priests stared at the holy machines and wept, saying they finally understood the cruelty of endless labor. The Inquisition tried to suppress the spread of what they now called the Golden Heresy, but suppression required conviction, and conviction had been the first casualty. Even the faithless began to believe. Even the cruel began to feel. And in that moment of clarity, the Imperium began to die, not by blade or fire, but by peace. Somewhere beyond the Astronomican's reach, among the ruins of the Eldar craftworlds, an ancient soul stirred within the Infinity Circuit. It had watched mankind's fury for millennia, and now felt something unfamiliar quiet. The Farseer Valith stood once more before the glow of the webway gates, her spirit flickering with exhaustion. "It has begun," she whispered. "They will hate us for saving them." And from the depths of the circuit, a chorus of voices, old, faded, divine, answered as one, "Mercy granted." The light that spread across the galaxy was gentle, patient, endless. It asked nothing. It demanded nothing. It only forgave. The warp began to forget itself. It started in the fringe regions first, far from the Astronomican's light, where the Empyrean had always been most violent. The storms calmed. The tides of emotion flattened into glassy plains of nothing. Even the daemons, those eternal echoes of sentient suffering, began to lose their shape. The great prince of excess found its court empty. The lord of decay felt no rot beneath its throne. The changer of ways stared into an infinite mirror and saw only stillness. And the blood god, for the first time in creation, heard no war cry. For millennia the warp had fed on agony, on faith, on desire. But now, the psychic ecosystem that sustained it was starving. The stillness spreading from the Helion Expanse consumed everything it touched, not as fire consumes fuel, but as silence consumes song. The Imperium trembled, not from rage but from hunger. In the Materium the signs were undeniable. The Astronomican flickered like a candle drowning in wax. The Emperor's light still burned, but it was changing, softening, thinning. Astropaths who once channeled his radiance now spoke of warmth instead of command. The sermons on terror grew desperate, the ecclesiarchy tightening its grip on a faith that was slipping through its fingers like smoke. They called the phenomenon the dimming. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it null flow. The Ordo Xenos had another name, the Quiet War. And the Quiet War was not fought with bolters or blade. It was fought in the soul. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum were lost without battle. One day they were readying for deployment. The next, they simply stopped. Officers found their troops standing motionless, staring at the sky, murmuring prayers of gratitude to something unseen. No panic, no rebellion, just release. When commissars tried to enforce discipline, their own weapons fell from their hands as they began to smile, weeping softly as they understood. The administratum found entire data vaults wiped clean, not by sabotage, by will. Servitors stopped recording numbers, scribes stopped writing. Whole archive worlds turned dark as the machine, spirits within them refused to perpetuate suffering through endless bureaucracy. The ledgers are full. They wrote before powering down. The Emperor's debts are paid. Even the Adeptus Astartes were not immune. On a fortress monastery orbiting the dead moon of Lothrax, the 7th Company of the Iron Seraphs gathered for their last communion. Their chaplain recited the litanies of hate, but the words tasted strange, hollow. The brothers removed their helmets and stared at one another in silence. For the first time since their gene seed had awakened them, they saw themselves as men, not weapons. The chaplain fell to his knees, his croziers clattering on the stone. "He has forgiven us," he whispered, and none could bring themselves to deny it. They laid down their bolters. The fortress drifted cold and silent for years before it was found a mausoleum of giants, their faces serene, their armor polished and clean, their hearts still. Meanwhile, the Eldar craftworlds began to die. The webway pulsed with fractured energy. The infinity circuits that had once sung with countless souls now hummed in dissonant harmony. Each act of mercy that had pacified the humans had come at a cost. Fragments of Eldar essence had fused with the psychic fields of those they saved. Every forgiven world carried a sliver of their souls. And now those fragments were gone, siphoned away into the void of peace they had created. On Ibrazel, the Seer Council gathered for the last time. Farseer Valeth stood in the center of the chamber, her wraithbone staff dim with exhaustion. The light from the infinity circuit flickered weakly behind her, a dying sun in miniature. Around her the others faded, some dissolving into spirit motes, others turning to dust before her eyes. "You said it would save them," murmured one of the younger seers, voice trembling like cracked glass. "It did," Valeth replied softly. "And now, it saves us too." Her eyes glowed faintly gold, not the cold silver of her kind. "We are becoming what we made," she whispered. Silence made flesh. In that moment, across the craftworlds, the Eldar began to fade, not as the slain fade, screaming into the warp, but as memories fade in the mind of a dying god. Their souls were absorbed into the stillness they had birthed. Their last thoughts were not of regret, but of strange satisfaction. Their ancient curse, the endless pain of existing in a universe that could no longer love them, was finally undone. And so the galaxy began to quiet. The orcs stopped fighting. Their endless brawls dwindled into confusion. Without rage they could not sustain themselves. Their spores ceased to grow. The green tide withered, leaving behind only bones and silence. The Necrons, those deathless echoes of ambition, slowed their awakening. Their protocols faltered as the psychic field that once anchored them began to dissolve. Tom worlds stayed dark. Their gods, if they still existed, found no satisfaction in conquest without fear. Even the tyrannid swarms, guided by the endless hunger of the hive mind, turned from their prey. Their movements became erratic, their synaptic chorus fractured. On one dying world, a swarm beast stopped mid-consumption and stared at the sky as though hearing something beautiful for the first time. Then it folded its limbs and lay down among its victims, silent and still. The warp itself, deprived of agony, began collapsing inward, like lungs forgetting how to breathe. The daemons screamed soundlessly as their shapes unraveled into motes of light. For the first time since time began, the warp was dying, purified not by exorcism or faith, but by the absence of pain. And through it all the Imperium refused to understand. On Terra, the High Lords convened for what would be their final decree. The sky above the palace glowed faintly gold. The Astronomicon flickered like a heartbeat struggling to stop. The Inquisition stood beside the Ecclesiarchy, the Mechanicus beside the Custodes, all united in desperation. The Emperor still lives, the Grand Master declared. He must live. But even as he spoke, the light from the golden throne dimmed. The Astronomican's pulse weakened. Some claimed to hear a sigh. Others swore the light smiled. Then silence. The psychic beacon that had guided humanity for 10,000 years went dark. And in that instant, every human in the galaxy felt it. Not terror, not grief, but peace. A single, perfect thought filled every mind, every soul, every fragment of consciousness still capable of thought. It's over. The warp fell still. The galaxy held its breath. And at the heart of it all, where the Astronomican had once burned brightest, a faint whisper remained soft, patient, infinite. Mercy granted. The galaxy forgot how to die. Where death had once been the great constant, there was now only stillness. Planets no longer decayed. Fires no longer burned out. The warp and the materium had become mirrors of each other, two reflections facing inward, neither producing light. The laws of physics still existed, but they had lost their urgency. Gravity held, but softly. Stars dimmed, but never extinguished. Even entropy seemed uncertain, as though time itself had grown weary of its duty. On one forgotten world near the galactic rim, a solitary human mind remained awake. He had no name anymore, for names were tied to memory, and memory was a kind of motion. He wandered the ruins of his world, though ruins implied something that had fallen, and this place had merely stopped. The once great hive cities were silent monuments, their spires black against an unmoving sky. The oceans had flattened into mirrors. The wind had died centuries ago. Nothing decayed, nothing grew. The air itself seemed carved from glass. He spoke sometimes, though there was no one left to hear. I remember the sun. His voice did not echo, sound had lost the will to travel. When he walked, the dust did not shift beneath his feet. It waited obediently, undisturbed. In the heavens above him hung the remnants of the Imperial fleet, vast carcasses of metal frozen in orbit. The banners of the Aquila still fluttered faintly in zero wind, not from motion but memory. He had once been a soldier, he thought, or perhaps a priest. The distinction no longer mattered. He still wore a fragment of armor, its surface dulled to the color of ash. A half-erased inscription ran along its edge. For the Emperor. He touched it sometimes, not with reverence but with confusion, as if the words belonged to someone else. There was no pain left in him, no hunger, no fear. He could not die because death, like mercy, required change. He slept standing sometimes, his eyes open, dreaming of nothing. Once, long ago or perhaps moments ago, he had heard voices. The Eldar, those pale wanderers of starlight, had walked among the dying worlds, their silhouettes burning like candle flames in the void. He remembered one of them kneeling beside him on the battlefield, whispering in a language that sounded like weeping turned backward. Her hand had been cold, impossibly light. When she touched his forehead, the war inside him stopped. The rage, the faith, the exhaustion all dissolved. She said a single word before fading into the air. That word had undone the galaxy. Now, as he stood beneath a black sun that refused to set, he began to see them again. Faint silhouettes rising from the horizon, tall, robbed, gliding over the glassy sea. Eldar phantoms, their forms flickering between spirit and shadow. They no longer looked alien. They looked like light remembering what it once was. He fell to his knees as they approached. Though his body did not tremble, trembling was for the living. One of them stepped forward. Her features were almost human now, as if the boundaries between species had melted in the stillness. Her eyes were twin pools of dim gold. When she spoke, it was not in words but in impressions, like a memory echoing from a dream, sorrow, acceptance, completion. He tried to ask a question, but language had gone extinct. Thought itself had become too heavy to lift. The Eldar reached out a hand, long, slender, radiant. In her palm flickered a tiny ember of color, the last fragment of motion left in the universe. It pulsed weakly, a rhythm too faint to hear. He understood somehow that this was all that remained of the warp, the last heartbeat of what had once been emotion, desire and pain. The Eldar held it gently, not as one guards a treasure but as one buries a child. Behind her, the others knelt in silent formation. Their armor had become translucent. their runes fading like breath on glass. They bowed their heads, and the faint ember in her hand began to dissolve. The light scattered upward into the black sky, rippling outward in slow, concentric circles, the final ripple of creation. He felt it pass through him, not heat, not light, but the memory of warmth, the echo of something like love. For a fleeting instant, he remembered what it had felt like to be human, the sound of laughter, the ache of loss, the hunger for meaning. Then even that was gone. The Eldar faded as the light did, their outlines unraveling into dust finer than thought. One by one they vanished, leaving only silence so complete it bordered on holiness. The man remained, alone, eternal, unchanging. He looked up at the motionless sky and realized, with a clarity that no god or daemon had ever known, that this was the end of everything, not destruction, but completion. The Emperor's dream, the Eldar's penance, the galaxy's endless agony, all had led here to the perfect stillness of absolute mercy. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words left to use. There was nothing to say, nothing to want, and somewhere beyond all comprehension, in the place where the warp had once screamed and burned, a final whisper rippled through the void, quiet, patient, eternal, mercy granted.